Hey, Angela, how are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you for joining us. Hello, everybody.
Hello, everybody. Remind everybody who you are and how you got into being VC and working at Andreessen Horowitz.
Yes, nice to meet everyone. I've loved being at this conference. I'm general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, focused on all things fintech. And I think, like many of us, I have a career that makes sense looking backwards, connecting the dots, but maybe didn't make a ton of sense on the way there. I wanted to be an accountant growing up, followed by a tax lawyer. My physicist dad talked me out of both of those, and I ended up studying engineering, to which I loved taking math classes and realized I had no talent in anything practical whatsoever. So what did I do? I actually ran the campus pub, which gave me an inkling into business. I was like, I want to do something in business. Growing up in Ottawa, and if you think that at the time, this was kind of pre the real ecosystem, and so I was like, well, I should go to business school. And then I quickly look up, not on the internet at that time, how much these things cost. I was like, ooh, 60,000 American dollars. I should find someone to pay for this. Worked at a great consulting firm. They paid for me to come to California. That was going to be 2 years. It's now been 20. And then I have taken a circuitous tour. I tried to be a professional marathoner for a few years, which is completely irrelevant, except for many days, sometimes you just need to wake up at 5 a.m. and put one foot in front of the other. So I think it does apply to lots of jobs. And then I spent 10 years doing product, which I loved. And so I did VC for a little bit, sort of figured out you're much more valuable as a board member. You have a much better sense of intuition if you get onto the operating side. I initially left to do product thinking, oh, I'll just hop back into VC, and then I discovered I loved it. So I got to help start an early startup. We got bought into Google. I was fortunate enough to get to be the sort of founding product manager on mobile Chrome, and so I scaled that for close to 5 years. And then, fintech was becoming a thing, which turned out to be a much more relevant way to play in financial services than being an accountant. Apologies to the accountants in the audience. And I came over to Andreessen Horowitz, and here a decade later.
The rest is history. So somebody smart once said every company will be a fintech company, claim to fame. But has every company become a fintech company? Where are we at in the cycle? Because if you cast your mind back to 2021, felt like things were a little crazy. Then things have changed. So what's your readout of where we are in fintech in the cycle?
Yeah, I think, so you'll get a different answer from everybody you ask here. And one of the most interesting things about being on the investing side is everyone takes a lens based on their background. And so I very much think with respect to product. And luckily for me in financial services, there's lots of better products that need to be built, which we'll talk about. But also it's helpful to think in product cycles. And so, right, you've got the era of the PC, the era of the internet, the era of the iPhone. And I'd argue now we have a big product cycle shift or platform shift, which is in generative AI. And the way, if you harken back to the iPhone, and I remember these conversations because I was in my VC career V1, initially it was, this is not going to be that big of a deal. Everyone's just making these mobile web pages. Not that big of a deal. And then, 2006, 7 was the iPhone. 2009, we got experiences like Uber. And so it feels very similar with the infrastructure of, ChatGPT 3.5, I think was March 22. And then we spent all last year with many people dismissing Gen AI, saying, just GPT wrappers. Right? But now, the infrastructure has settled a little bit more. There's lots of open source models. There's lots of developer tools to build on top of those open source models. There's even, lowest cost routing. There's something called Frugal GPT, which is my new favorite, of how do you use the models in the right appropriate ways. And so I think that this platform shift is here. It's a new product cycle. And if you can tell from my enthusiasm, I'm pretty excited about all of the things that are going to be built in 24.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I've walked around the Fintech Meetup, there's been a bit of cynicism about this as a potential platform shift, and people are getting a bit bored of hearing the hype. So you really do believe that whilst there's hype, there is a genuine novel platform shift here, and how do you think about the frameworks that help you understand this emerging landscape and market?
Yeah, I'll talk. So first, I have my investment framework in general, which is always going to hold. So I come from a product mindset, and there's really no substitute to just really deep diving in a market, which is one of the reasons I love coming to things like this. It's talking to everyone who's tried to build new companies in a space, the current companies that are building in this space, all of the banks and the people that have built great companies for 20 years, and you just get a sense of what might be possible. And then new companies you need a product insight, you need a distribution insight, and then in particular, right, you need a why now. And so I think generative AI doesn't negate the need for those two other things, but it's a pretty damn good why now. And so one of the expressions that I keep reminding myself of is that there's no bad ideas, only early ideas. And so if I think of all these spaces that I've looked at, over the past decade in my time at VC, and I'd come to these conclusions like, oh, banks will never rip and replace the software, or this thing is just too hard to build. And I'm now open-minded to the fact that literally all my conclusions might be totally wrong. And some of that is you can build 10x better products with some of this generative AI. Like workflow tools where you ingest all sorts of documents, like you don't even need to touch those documents anymore. Like people that you need to hire 100x of them, well, they could actually maybe turn into agents. And so I encourage all of my team, and actually would encourage any operator, to just rethink things that you thought weren't that exciting, might have been too hard, maybe there's not much opportunity, because a lot has changed.
A lot does change, and the why now is really crucial. So I want to double click on the specific trends you're seeing. What's exciting you?
So many things. So I think, and I always come back to when I was running. So product, in some ways, is very sexy, right? Because you're getting to create these new things, and it's this combination of it's technical, it's user experience, it's empathetic. But then there's just like any job, there's just a shit ton of schlep, right? And you never have enough time, you can never hire enough people. It's very hard to find the really smart person that does whatever. And so one of the frameworks I've been thinking through is okay, does generative AI in some ways provide an abundance of time, an abundance of labor, and even in some respects an abundance of intelligence? And so think of your job and the X% of it that in theory you could automate away, right? I do a lot of investment research. It would be amazing if I had something smart enough where I could just click of a button, tell me about this maybe older company I don't know that much about and what went wrong and all these pivots. And there's a lot of new companies that are actually trying to do that. It's not going to take away those jobs. It's just going to make them infinitely more efficient.
There was a company I remember WhatsApping you recently, and what it does is it creates investment analyst-like reports based on all kinds of unstructured, crazy bits of data and spreadsheets and everything else, and it makes PowerPoint slides, which is the most bank thing in the world to do, is to make PowerPoint slides. And it's entirely possible that machines could start to do that. But what do you think? Are there any case studies out there that stand out to you?
Well, there should be more. And I'm sure many have read about, Klarna just recently put out one, right? Where they do Gen AI for customer service, which I think is going to be one of the most recent use cases. But they say they've got automation for effectively the equivalent of 700 agents. You think okay, you've got to take some hit on customer service. Turns out their NPS is exactly the same. They're resolving it's gone down from 11 minutes down to 2 minutes, and then they expect it's going to save them $25 million a year. So there should be more case studies that look like that. And I think the smartest, larger companies are thinking through, all right, what are the workflows I have that still take a lot of time? And it turns out many of those are ingesting documents, putting them into a system. And there's been many systems over the years that have tried to fix this. I think we're at the moment in time when we might actually be able to fix this. My soon-to-be written blog post is going to be entitled "The Death of the PDF." I'm saying that here so I actually get it out there, but it's very true. There's a lot of just paper pushing going on that could be solved in better systems.
We had the decade of robotic process automation where everything was going to be a process and a workflow, and that only got so far because sometimes processes are highly variable and the workflow doesn't work. It's a doesn't work flow.
Yep.
So finding the thing that works there is changing. How do you think about who the buyer is? Is the buyer changing in financial services? Is there a different kind of buyer now, a different buying behavior? You said earlier that people don't rip and replace. Is that changing?
Yeah, and I think that's if I think of the two trends that I'm excited about, obviously generative AI, but Even as an enthusiastic VC, I have to admit, not everything is generative AI. The second trend, which is really playing out, is purchasing used to be made purely by a financial buyer. And so then you'd make this case based on ROI, and then some poor developers that often sat in a dark room would be in charge of implementing this. And that shift, I think, actually has moved very quickly, where now it might not be a technical buyer fully, but the technical buyer has a lot of influence. And so you see even companies that you would imagine would never have this. They're like, hey, check out my developer portal, or check out my API docs. And so it kind of means like no longer can you get away with needing to have a huge services component. And so one view as a VC is you could look across the large companies and say, okay, where are the software platforms, we picked on UiPath, for instance, that are doing very well, but they actually make even more revenue off services. Are we at a moment in time where we have the technology where it could just be software? And then, oh, by the way, the buyer is technical enough to understand that and realize that and appreciate that I think there's just a more open-mindedness to changing up some of these platforms that I think had traditionally been thought of as relatively untouchable.
Always got to wonder about the why now, definitely. You are, of course, famous for saying every company will become a fintech company, but my instinct is not every team, not every bank was ready for the consequences of everybody becoming a fintech company. We've seen some consent orders, we've seen some enforcement actions, we've seen some challenges with people going into partner banking, sponsor banking. Do you think every company will become a fintech company, or has that thesis been challenged?
So I'm gonna still be very bullish on this thesis, and you can keep me in check next year. I think we've learned. I'll maybe make 3 points. I think we've learned the first thing, that compliance is a lot harder than we thought that it was. In my internally, as I'm talking about investments, one of my favorite sayings is compliance is a competitive advantage. It used to be this backwater thing that you would give, whereas like companies that take that very seriously and even better automate it are going to be at a much higher place. So I think it's a lot harder than we thought that it was. But then if you look at why were companies becoming financial services companies, they wanted to better retain their users, better monetize their users, and provide them more services. Has that changed? Definitely not. So I think that's kind of point one. And then point two, which I think helps this, the corollary to every company will be a fintech company, is every fintech company will spin out a fintech infrastructure company. And so one of my favorite theses, and actually Sardine would be a perfect one of this, is an entrepreneur that had to solve a really hard, often boring back office product. And they found out it's a lot harder to do, and many companies have the problem and they're not solving it, and so they spin out and they build that as a company. Right? So Sardine is one in fraud, ran fraud at Coinbase. If you can solve fraud for Coinbase, you can solve fraud for a lot of different things, right? And now that there's compliance companies who had to onboard thousands of small businesses, that's pretty damn difficult. Maybe other people also have this problem. I'm going to be a new KYB platform. And so you can just, the quality of the entrepreneurs that are going after these opportunities is just getting better and better.
It's an interesting Venn diagram of people who get this weird, specific problem that was traditionally an operational job, but is now a technology job, but with the depth of having operated in it. It's an interesting combo. So we got about 5 minutes left. I want to bring us to the kind of back to the market readout and where we go from here. Because 2024, it feels like we've been off to a bit of a different start to 2023. It feels like the mood might have changed. Are we back? Are we just having a moment in the sun and it's all going to unravel again when macro turns? Interest rates are still high. Are we back?
Oh, we're more than back. So as you've stated, the reports of our death were greatly overstated. But I'd say a few things. Last year, my infrastructure colleagues were deploying lots of capital, and I would say the application layer was still waiting for things to sort out a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I think now the best product people, the best CEOs, feel like there's enough that's settled such that the product experiences that they've been imagining have the infrastructure to kind of pull those together. Mm-hmm. So I think that's point one. Point two is, yes, high interest rates, which mean anything where you have a high cost of capital. Those type of businesses that were very popular in ZIRP are much harder to do now. So you might say, OK, the market's smaller. I would actually argue very differently, because now you can make these 10x better software products. So any of these infrastructure companies, or any of these infrastructure that any of the banks, the insurance companies that are sitting on now, and software is a much better business, or it's at least a higher margin business model. Those opportunities are very much open. And there's the types of entrepreneurs that really understand the go-to-market, that really understand the product, that are starting to tackle them.
It feels like fintech discovered lending, but it discovered lending in a different way, and it did it software first, which is kind of interesting. But the classic kind of criticism of VC was, the generations of new lenders that come to market and will do quite well for a few years with a VC valuation, but then struggle as the public markets view them as a lending valuation. So do you see there's a difference in business model through embedded? So I'm thinking about Strike Capital, I'm thinking about embedded lending that really does put you in the software space. Is that what you mean by sort of the change in the interest rate environment?
Yeah, well, I actually think lending can be an amazing way to monetize. And so it's much more a question of order of operations. You have to build a platform that is sticky, that whoever your user is coming back for a daily operation, and is not going to be always looking for the next cheapest thing or the next best thing. So once you build that, then you should layer all sorts of financial services on top of it. So I'd say that was the case for lending in the ZIRP environment, or even lending now. I think my point on software, let's say, I'll use a specific example, loan origination systems. Generally, nobody loves their loan origination system, but I would also say they weren't something that we're actively looking to rip and replace. And now, if you talk to the handful of very talented founders that are building in this space, what they'll tell you is, actually, my product is so much better that I'm getting incumbent banks that you wouldn't have thought would be that fast to adopt new software to actually adopt this software. And yeah.
No, continue, please.
No. And so I think if I was going to sort of leave one thing that I believe in 2024 is there's a lot of, as you put, skepticism around generative AI. And I think depending on what crowd you're in, the conversation goes to, ooh, what if it tells my customer the wrong thing? What if it hallucinates? What are the risks? How do I bound it? I think the conversation should be, what if it works?
Interesting. But is there a legitimate use case here that you're starting to see? You mentioned picking a model, and you mentioned loans and the PDFs. Could you bring that to life for me with a use case? Is there anything you've seen out there where you're I could absolutely see that being potentially successful as a use case one day? Anything spring to mind?
There's many. So think of your own business and be all right, what workflows do I have that are full of errors or take a lot of time? I will pick on SBA lending. There's actually another great company that was started 20 plus years ago that started with SBA lending in Encino, right? So SBA lending, many documents, often takes weeks. Now there's companies that are great, I can just ingest all of those documents. I will structure them appropriately. I will give you a readout of exactly why I'm making decisions. It's not black box UI. And so your underwriter can be 100x faster and get more business through the door. It's a significant uplift to revenue. Unsurprisingly, they're getting a lot of traction.
Unsurprisingly. Well, Angela, thank you so much for joining me on stage today, and hopefully we can do this again. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.